Hi. This week, the Minister of State for Education, Mr. Jayant Chaudhary, has announced in the Parliament, based on a question that was asked of how many schools were closed, the government schools that were closed over the last 10 years, there was a response that came in which said that 93,000 schools, government schools, were closed down in the last 10 years in India. We obviously covered that because we're a news platform, and then a lot more questions came in of whether there's possibility that private schools might have been added. Maybe because of the merger of the schools, there might have been that the students actually moved from one school to another school because the states at times, to economize the whole thing, might have actually clubbed two schools and made into one, and those kind of questions came in. So I thought we should actually lay bare what exactly is the data set at this point in time, and where does we as a country like India, where do we stand at this point in time in terms of the demographics, education, and how our young population is growing. Remember, we call ourselves the youngest nation on earth, and about 60-65% people are below 35 years of age, so you're more productive, and because of that, we will claim a demographic dividend. The data that I'm about to show you should shock us, should not surprise us, and at the same time should spur us for action, because this is not the way a nation can be run. I told you, last week we covered this story. It was done by our reporter Sheena Sachdeva, where we essentially talked of how India saw 93,000 schools shut down over the last 10 years, and MP and UP lead the closures. And this is the statement made by the Minister of State for Education, Mr. Jayant Chaudhary, in the Lok Sabha. So this is what the statement was. And the questions obviously kept coming in, so we thought we should look at that closely. Amongst all the schools, which is public and private, when we look at that, the total schools in 2015-16 was about 15.22 lakh. In 24-25, it fell down to 14.71 lakh, which means that the number of schools that closed down is 51,000, even assuming you include the private. Now, the years might differ, so to that extent, a few numbers might differ here and there, but the overall trend is something that you should follow instead of getting into the semantics of this detail and that detail. So, even assuming we include private and we take it for a 10-year block, about 51,000 schools closed down, which is about 3.5% of the schools got closed down. Now, the important thing, because there was one question that came in which said that possibly the students would have moved because the government merged two schools to make it one, and so that there is better usage of infrastructure and facilities and all. So we also looked at that. There is one system that works in India which is called UDICE, which is essentially called the Unified District Information System for Education. Unified District Information System for Education, which is called UDICE. This essentially is a major management information system in India for collecting school level data covering infrastructure, enrollment, and teacher details for about 1.5 million schools. Now, this data is what we all rely on when we talk of education in the country, because it is coming from every district. So every district, whatever schools are there, the district collect the data, collate the data and send it, and it all comes to at a national level where we combine and collate and aggregate all this data. From this data, when you see it, the numbers are very, very shocking and depressing, right? Because the number of students who are enrolled in schools in 2015-16 were 27.1 crore. Repeat, in 2015-16, it is 27.1 crore. In 24-25, the UDICE data given by the government of India, it's a collection of the data which is collected by the government of India, is 24.69 crores, which means that 2.41 crore students fell off the charts as far as school education is concerned. Remember, during the same time, the population kept increasing. So every student, child who is born at over 5 years' time should join a school also. So ideally, when the 27.1 crore should have jumped to 30-31 crores. But at this point in time, the 27.1 crore has dropped by 2.41 crore students in schools. Then this is data that is a government data, and it is not my personal data. So the schools closed down, the enrollment in schools also closed down. Now, why did this happen? That's again an interesting question that we should be looking at some point in time. Because around the same time, in 2015-16, the population of India was 131 crores. Today, it's 146 crores. So the population went up by 11%, whereas the number of school students went down by 9%. Which means if you look at it as a proportion, we actually are 20% down in terms of population to student ratio as compared to what it was in 2015-16. So one-fifth of the students are no longer going and joining or admitting themselves in a school. One-fifth of the students who are born over the past many years are no longer going and admitting themselves in a school. This is extremely agonizing for a country like India, which is dreaming of earning its demographic dividend. And remember, demographic dividend doesn't come unless you invest in education. It doesn't come because you're the most populous nation. It comes because you're a very productive nation. And that would not happen if your children are not educated. Now, I look further, trying to understand why all these things are happening, and that may be a larger policy discussion that we will do at some point in time, of the kind of investments that we are doing at a state level, at a central level, to make students get onto schools, right? But at this point in time, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with about 12% jump in population, 3.5% drop in schools, and 9% drop in student enrollment, and that is the number that you'll be dealing with. And if you were to create it as a proportion of the total population increase, you are 1/5 of the nation. There is a drop in terms of percentage because you essentially are dealing with lesser schools and lesser students while the population increase. So it's about 20% kind of a gap that we're dealing with. And why did this happen? One of the questions can be that when you actually reduce the number of government schools and reduce access to schools for people who are around a certain area, and you want them to move over to or walk down to 5-7 kilometers in a distant area, children do drop out. Parents, in a country like India, that becomes a challenge. And two, you always would say that we created more capacity to private schools. Private schools are slightly expensive. So we're dealing with two issues here. One is affordability of education, two is access to education. By reducing the number of government schools, you reduce access to education. By increasing the private schools and assuming that they will take care of the increased population, you actually, because of affordability issue, again you actually hit at those people who can't afford good education. So you're actually, waging a war on affordability of education and access to education by doing all these things. Because if you look at it again in the same period, 2015-16 to 24-25, government schools have fallen by 9% and private schools have gone up by 15%. But they still could not match up to the closure of the government schools. Which is where, while the government school fell by about 93,000 seats, schools, the total number of schools that have dropped out is about 54,000. So only 35-40,000 could be, added by the private schools. But remember, whenever a private school is getting added at the cost of a government school, the affordability is a question mark, and because of which many students don't join the place. So we are essentially dealing with a issue where the closure of government schools, the increase in private schools, hasn't compensated for the kind of increase in population that we have as a country. And very clearly, when you see the states that are really lagging behind, dramatically, Madhya Pradesh is about 30,000 schools are closed down in the last 10 years. Uttar Pradesh, 25,000 schools. Orissa, 10,000 schools. Assam, 8,000 schools. Jharkhand, 5,000 schools, 5,500 schools. All this is leading to a bigger problem that we as a country will face at some point in time. Because listen, we don't want our young population to be making reels and staging rallies and all. We want them to be productive. We want them to be in the schools. We want them to learn. We want them to become so constructively looking forward for life and zest for life that they'll start contributing to the nation building. But that doesn't happen because you actually are creating a bunch of people who are born in the country, but there is no school to go. So what they do is to end up creating stuff which is not good socially. So it's very important for us as a country to understand how do we deal with this situation. The only way we deal with this situation is that the governments must step in and start increasing the budgets for schools. You need to create more schools. You need to create more access to schools. You need to create education affordable. You need to ensure that there is affordable education available for all of us. Every single citizen who is born in this country. You don't become the best nation of Vishwaguru just because you are most populous. You become Vishwaguru because your population is very productive, very constructive, and actually can contribute to national growth. And that, by the data that I've seen over the last 10 years, and this is data that I've seen from 2015 onwards, is extremely depressing for a country like India, and this needs to be addressed right away.